Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Sunday School Dropouts. I am super excited because we have week 2 of Andrew Pledger being here. Andrew is on our podcast really recently, and it's the episode called Going Broke for God, where he shared more of his story about being a student at Bob Jones University. And we talked about kind of some of the financial aspects, how high control religion talks about finances, the ways that there's a lot of demanding of time and energy and money and resources, the ways that religion kind of can teach you messaging about money and finances that ultimately just benefits them and keeps you inside a system that is ultimately dependent on them. So if you haven't listened to that episode, I would encourage you to go back and listen. It's really excellent. It was such a wonderful conversation. And you heard us talking in there about how many aspects of Andrew's story were worth a deeper dive. And so we decided to invite him back onto the podcast and to go deeper into his story. So today we're doing that. We're going a little bit deeper into his background inside the Independent Fundamentalist Baptist Church, as well as him starting to reckon with his sexuality, his journey into Bob Jones University, how his sexuality was something that he continued to have to wrestle with and ultimately was something that's got him kicked out of Bob Jones University. So if you're curious to know more, make sure that you stick around. It's a really wonderful episode, and Andrew is just an incredible human being. So I hope you listen to his story. Like we say every week, we recognize that some of the topics that we discuss in any episode could bring up feelings, emotions, triggers that might require more processing or could be too much to handle right now. So please always feel free to skip any episode or parts of episodes and come back if and when you're ready. Our goal is to help you trust your own body, your own lived experience, so you can take what you need and leave what you don't. Welcome again, Andrew, two-time Sunday School Dropout. It's so good to have you back.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I loved our
Yeah.
conversation last time, and I look forward to
Yes.
all the things we're going to dig into this time.
Yes, it's going to be great. I mean, I've had the pleasure of getting to know you over the last couple of years, so I know bits and pieces of your story. And as we were doing our last episode, I was like, oh my gosh, there's so much more to your story that feels like it makes what we talked about in the last episode even like more robust and vibrant, but also like just so it would be so helpful for people to hear your
hmm
story coming out of, independent fundamentalist Baptists in, all the things that we're going to talk about today, including some more Bob Jones stuff, because we want
Yeah.
to hear how you got kicked out of Bob
Yeah.
Jones. That feels very, very important.
Ooh,
Yeah, Sunday School Dropout, Bob Jones Dropout. Like you've got a good list behind you.
oh my gosh,
So,
yes.
yeah,
Oh my
it'll be
God.
good. But, one of the things we like to do is just kind of have people talk, give a little bit of an overview of just what it was like to grow up inside of independent fundamentalist Baptists. Just, yeah, a little bit about your background.
Yeah, I mean, I know I covered that some a little bit in the last episode. I think I did more history maybe than
Mhm.
experiences, but I think for me, growing up in that was all I knew, the IFB movement. I was homeschooled in that my entire life. And, growing up in an environment where you think that your group is the only one that has the truth and everyone outside is wrong and evil. So there was a very much us versus them mentality. And I had a
Yeah.
strong fear of that outside world very much. And
Hmm.
of course, being homeschooled with IFB curriculum, specifically a Becca, that's what.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, you're like, ooh,
Yeah.
you're like,
I
yes, you're
know
like, I
what that
know.
is. So
Ooh,
sorry.
yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, growing up very isolated in that environment, and it's interesting that it's called Sunday School Dropouts. I actually reconnected with one of my Sunday school teachers
Oh
from
my
the
goodness.
past, and we've
Wow.
become good friends now. I actually talked to him on the phone this morning for an hour and a half. We talk on the phone at least twice a month. Just we catch up, and he's helping me processing some things
Yeah.
too, because I've been trying to unpack because there were many
Mhm.
emotions growing up in that. Looking back, there was fear, anxiety, confusion. There's so much to unwrap because you're forced to conform to this black and white system,
Yeah.
but there's so many confusing things, but you're not allowed to question that, and like making that fit inside your mind when that doesn't work, that
Hmm.
really fucks you up, just to say that. That fucks you.
Yeah, absolutely. Is the
Um,
best way to say it.
yeah,
Yeah.
it just really fucks you.
Mhm.
And so, growing up in this very insular environment, very afraid of the outside world, very judgmental towards anyone outside of our system. And it was interesting because as I've been unpacking some of the theology too and its impact on me, the IFB church I grew up in, Gospelite in Walkertown, North Carolina, you know, it's one thing for them to say something, but
Mhm.
also look at what they do. So they said so many things, but also expected something different. So, for example,
Yeah.
I've been unpacking just their own salvation message, which they preach a pretty typical, I feel like,
Mhm.
mainstream gospel message, but they would always end up adding works into that.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Like,
Yes.
your faith and salvation isn't based on works, but also make sure you work your ass off?
And so that was interesting to me because as I was unpacking that with him, I was like, wow, I'm like, they said it was through Jesus alone,
Mhm.
but it was all these expectations of these outward things to do to prove like, oh, Jesus can save you, but also following these rules is proof of your salvation. And it was, happily attending the church regularly, reading your King James Bible every day, tithing happily. Oh, and now as I'm thinking about this and I've thought about it, I'm like, oh wow, all these things that benefit the church. Oh,
Yeah.
you serving with a happy heart, just doing all these outward things. And so it was this culture of performance, constantly performing and not trying to make the group look bad. So yeah,
Yeah.
so I was taught the Bible is inerrant, perfect, KJV only. And I recently thought about it. They told us the Bible was perfect, and they also told us that we're the only Bible that someone else could read. So it's
Yeah.
like I didn't
Yeah.
I think
Mhm.
on an unconscious level, like with the logic with that, the Bible is perfect, and you're the only Bible someone else reads. That can push people to be follow a path of perfectionism, and I struggled a lot
Yes.
with perfectionism, performance in that, and I lived in so much fear of just doing one wrong thing, and God was going to get me,
Mhm.
and there was so much fear that make disobeying a rule, disobeying authority, that was going to lead you down this destructive path, and it was opening you up to Satan and demonic
Yeah.
influence, and even just your thoughts. So
Yeah.
it created this environment of it said, oh, we want to give you freedom, whatever, in Christ.
Mhm.
But it ended up being this environment that was very legalistic, and for
Yeah.
me, just experiencing so much fear of doing the wrong thing, trying to be perfect. I think I internalized, if I'm perfect and I follow these rules, I'll be safe. I'm
Mhm.
safe as long as I'm perfect.
Yeah. That's
And
such a high standard.
yes.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
so as I got older and older, I looking back on it, it's just so much was put on my back, I felt like, and so much trauma from a lot of the teachings from that environment because they're very much known for their fire and brimstone kind of sermons, very coercive with getting people to come to the altar. The church was all about what I noticed looking back is it was all about getting results. We had a bus ministry and we had boards on both sides of the auditorium that would tell us like how many numbers we had on each bus. And, sometimes we would have 2,000 people there with
Wow.
the bus ministry and the church. So it was all about performance and getting results.
Mhm.
And, separation is such a core thing in that environment too, which I think I talked about in the last
Yeah.
episode. It was like separate from all these outside worldly influences, and they decided what that was. And it was all about old time. I heard old time religion a lot growing up. Like, stay with that
Yeah.
old time religion. Like, literally anything that the outside world is doing is wrong because it's in the outside world. It didn't
Mhm.
matter
Yeah.
there was no, like, I guess, major explanation. It was like anything outside of our system is dangerous. And yeah, it was just as I got older and older, I was not seeing the results that they promised. That of the which honestly, like I was trying to look back, they promised eternal security is a doctrine that is
Mhm.
in the IFB also, and I think other Baptist denominations.
Yeah.
But it came with so many exceptions of like, oh yes, your salvation is secure, but you have to show these evidence of doing these things. So it wasn't really an eternal
Yes.
security. I
Mhm.
didn't feel
Mhm.
secure that I was going to go to heaven.
Mhm.
Can't remember how many times I've gotten resaved just to make
Right.
sure
So
I
many.
don't.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I
Yeah.
think
I
that's
get
a
that.
quick overview, I think,
Mm.
of what that was generally like. And then
Yeah.
we can get into, I guess,
Yeah.
my sexuality later, because then that was a whole other piece of
Yes. Yeah.
realization of my sexuality.
Mhm.
And they're very, very much anti-LGBTQ, very much.
Right.
And so
Yeah.
that caused a lot more like psychological and spiritual
Mhm.
trauma from those
I'm
teachings
sure.
and about it. But
Yeah.
yes.
Well, I'm like I really resonate with your story. I didn't grow up IFB, but I think there's so many similarities in high control religions
Mm-hmm.
anyways that it's like
Yes.
even though we may not have had
Mm-hmm.
all the same specific practices or whatnot, it's like, oh yeah, yeah, that was us too. And it just strikes me, not only what you were saying is like kind of this hypocrisy of like do this, but also this, and kind of speaking out of both sides of the mouth, but just like the level of hypervigilance,
Yes.
anxiety that is
Mm.
just kind of required to
Mm.
live in an environment like that. And how, I mean, what you talked about with like making mistakes, that was something I was absolutely terrified of. And because of that, had this like high level as a baseline of
Mm.
anxiety that I just thought was normal. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, that's just what life is being this anxious all the time that you're going to mess up.
Yeah.
And and to like hear somebody else say
Wow.
that and to know like yeah that like that's just the culture there is to live with a high level of anxiety just every moment of every day because of what you might do to show your fucked upness.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Yes. Yes. And like it was so much too, because I think something else about the IFB is they're all about recruiting families and getting
Mm,
the entire family involved. And then
interesting.
once they do, they try to, I mean, they end up convincing people that we're your only safe space.
Yeah,
Now that you're
that makes sense.
here, once you get saved, you don't need to be in contact with the outside world. You don't need to be friends with those worldly people. And so they also convince and terrify parents that if you do not do things our way, parent your children this way, really indoctrinate them with our teachings, they're going to go to hell. And so what happens is the IFB really scares parents into either putting their
Mm,
children in the IFB Christian school. There's a lot of IFB K through 12 schools that are attached, or homeschooling the children, and doing anything
yeah.
outside of that is
Mhm.
communicated that you're just giving your child to Satan and
Wow.
his influences. And so yeah, that was why I was homeschooled in the IFB movement my entire life. And to
Yeah.
really honestly, I was when you're born into the IFB, you're meant to stay in it for life. Like that is the expectation with
Yeah.
that. Like
Wow.
there was no acceptable reason to leave the IFB at
Yeah.
all. And they would really keep, because I've looked back on it, because I'm like, how did they take control over us? And I'm still like, it's something I'm still unpacking. And one of the things was, because I struggled back and forth, because I was like, oh well, they didn't really come to our house and tell us what to do. But then as I've thought about it, it reminds me of the IBLP on that documentary of how Chad talks about how they turned every father into a cult leader. And that really resonated
Yes.
with me,
Yeah.
because I was like, oh my gosh, he harped and harped on the dads. It was communicated the father is a protector of the home. And so it was on the father to enforce all of the IFB standards and rules. And if the father did not do that, then he was opening up the family to attacks from Satan. So yeah, there was just so much pressure. And something I've thought about too as I've been writing my own book, unpacking it, there were times when if the pastor felt like the fathers weren't doing enough to set the standards, he would just harp and harp on them from the pulpit and say like
Wow.
you need to search your family's homes for books. So I remember growing up a few times, our dad going through our stuff when the pastor
Wow.
demanded that. And we would be sitting in the room with my siblings and our dad we're like terrified as he's
Yeah.
going through our rooms and our stuff. And I'm just
Yeah.
it's insane because like I've thought about it. I was like, wow. I'm like,
Yeah.
it really worked well in their favor. They set up this system where they could control us without ever actually these staff members having to check up on us because the dads would do it. They would
Yeah.
terrify them into that. But
Wow.
yeah,
Yeah. Mhm.
that's an overview, I guess, of that
Yeah.
aspect.
Well, I feel like there's so many unique aspects to your story because, you grew up in this. And like you said in the last episode, there was some really pivotal moments of questioning where you were
Yes.
like starting to have some doubts and asking some questions, even as a teenager,
Mhm.
which I just find to be so incredible. It's like that resilience was just baked into you and it was
Mhm.
not going to shut up. Like, no matter how hard the pastor tried to,
Mm.
kind of kill it or, suppress it or whatever. I'm just curious if you can share a little bit more about that, maybe even how your sexuality played into that and where your parents' influence was at the time, because I feel like there was so many things going on, sexuality, asking questions, Bob Jones University, parents and
There's
homeschooling. Like it's so much.
It is so much, and I think as I've talked about on other interviews before, I think mental health and sexuality were definitely a big part of it. But I think something else too that I talked about is it always bothered me of how much people looked up to and adored our pastor. That always like, and I felt shame about that because everyone thought he was so special and so incredible. And I did not feel that growing up. I didn't experience what
Mm.
I guess the charisma that people thought flowed from him or that they liked about him. And I felt shame like, oh, what's wrong for me for not thinking that? And so that was
Yeah.
something that I would always like kind of push away. I was like, oh, just shut up. Like, don't think about that. And so that was one thing I felt like that was starting, which is honestly like
Yeah.
looking back, like you're not supposed to question the pastor.
Right.
You're
Yeah. That's
not.
like questioning God. I mean,
Yes,
essentially. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, and they put it that way.
Hmm.
And I was recently, I've been going back and rewatching some sermons just
Ooh,
yeah, I
I would have
know.
a panic attack.
I know. I was going back because sometimes as survivors we doubt ourselves. We're
Yeah.
like, was it really that bad? Or did they
Right.
really say this? Or did am I overreacting? And so I am also trying to collect, like document things from my own book to back up some of the claims I'm going to make. So that's one which is hard to do.
That makes
It
sense.
sucks to go
Oh,
back and do that. And so in a clip, he said, I didn't choose to be here. I didn't really want to be a pastor. God put me here.
ah, sure. I've
And
heard that line
I
before.
know,
Yeah.
and I heard that, and I'm like, you're definitely not the only one who has said that. But growing up as a child, that
Yeah.
kind of stuff leaves quite an
Yeah.
impression, and you're setting yourself up to not be questioned. And so I think that was something that was always in the back of my mind that was nudging, but I couldn't quite question that. It was like,
Mhm.
what is the shame of, oh, something's wrong with me
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
not feeling the same way that they seem to be feeling. And so as I got older too, I noticed that, all the guys around me were just becoming obsessed with girls. And that was just something that I was not experiencing. And I remember telling this story to someone that I remember being in my teen Sunday school class and the teacher talking about how we can overcome the lust of the flesh and overcome our sexual desires, and I thought that the Holy Spirit was working through me because I didn't struggle with that. I'm like, yes.
You were literally the purity culture poster child.
Oh, oh,
Yeah, I love that.
oh my gosh. So yeah, it was funny because before the awareness of my own sexuality, I just wasn't having those same it seemed like the same
Yeah.
desires that other guys were.
Mhm.
And so I was like, oh, I don't have to worry about that. and I'm fine. Like God's working through me, and like
Mhm.
they really had to like made us believe that we could overcome our sexual desires, which is so ridiculous
Yeah.
looking back
Yeah.
now. And like I'm still undoing the damage from that, most
I'm sure.
definitely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh
Absolutely.
my God.
Mm.
Yes. And so I think it was actually so when I did become aware of my sexuality, it was at our church's youth conference, actually.
Mm.
Yes, fine.
Yeah.
So, Gospel Light, they would do so many different conferences. We did a national sort of the Lord conference every year at the church. There was always a youth conference every year in the summer also. I think there were so many different conferences they did. But yeah, the youth conference, a lot of teenagers would come, especially I
Mhm.
think from the South, to come to our church this youth conference. And it was just a week of these IFB preachers scaring us about not to have sex before marriage,
Yeah. Yeah.
basically like promising that we're going to save sex for marriage, basically just trying to reinforce like, oh, don't be like the world. Like all these teenagers they're
Right.
drinking, they're smoking, they're having sex, and they're destroying their lives, and just scaring us, shaming us, and guilting us into recommitting to those ideals. And I remember going there. I remember walking into the auditorium, and this was so we had different buildings. So there was a big building, and then there was a teen church, there was the Christian school with a gym, and so this was in the teen church that the youth
Mhm.
conference was in. I remember walking in to meet with a friend, and he was towards the front, and I walked to the front. I'm like, oh, yeah, good to see you. And he introduced me to a friend that he brought, and
Ah.
I don't know. Yes, I
Fireworks.
know it was fireworks immediately, and like I thought that I liked him as a friend. And the
Yeah,
thing
that makes
was,
sense.
too, like I was so lonely. I didn't really at that point, I didn't have like good close friends, very isolated. Yes,
Mhm.
I was around other kids at the church, but it was very cliquey, and I was
Yeah.
also just such a very socially awkward teenager in that
Mm.
environment,
Yeah.
and it was just not relating to a lot of other people. And I felt different and didn't know why at that
Yeah.
point, but I felt
Mhm.
different in an environment that required conformity and sameness. And like I felt struggle
Mhm.
with that, and it made me
Yeah.
feel shame. But anyway, so I met him, and I thought that, oh, this is just a friendship, building. And as the week went on, like I had a desire to kiss him and make out with him, and I was like, "Oh
Yeah.
wow." I'm like, "This
Yeah.
is different.
That's different. Yeah.
That is definitely more than a friend." And I was confused about it because I was taught such black and white things, because growing up I heard the term sodomite, sodomite all the
Mm.
time. I don't remember hearing gay people. It was always like this very degrading term.
Right. Right.
And so I remember wondering like why, like I think, because I remember like when I started to realize it, I think it was like during free time that I just
Mhm.
walked away I went away by myself. I just sat down and I was like, what is going on? And just sat by myself. And finally someone did
Yeah.
come and find me,
Mhm.
but that I was by myself. But I just, I was really scared. I was
I would imagine
terrified
so. Yeah.
because I just wasn't sure what that meant. And
Right.
once I became to realize, like connecting the dots, connecting that to what they taught, I was like, oh my gosh, like I have to change this, or what is God going to do to me? And eventually I thought, like, if I
Right.
don't change this, God is going to kill me. Like that's the messaging that I took from that church.
Wow.
And
Oh.
so as those feelings grew more and more, I just didn't really know what to do with it. Besides like try to pray and like stuff it away or
Yeah.
pray for God to deliver or whatever. And I mean, I fell into like a deep, deep depression and just a lot of other mental
Oh.
health issues for just several
Mhm.
months.
Mhm.
And in that environment too, like mental health,
Oh, yeah.
it's not acknowledged. There's so
No.
much shame. It's a
Mhm.
spiritual issue. You're not
Yep.
believing or trusting God enough.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, through a lot to like dealing with the trauma of that, I mean, I've talked about it, I think, in several other interviews before, but it was really weird. But it was like, I'm trying to remember if there's the term for it, but anyways, it was just an extreme coping mechanism my mind did where my personality kind of split. And
Yeah.
I, so how I said it to my therapist, it was like the thought of me, so it was so awful. I couldn't stand the thought of being me or living, that my mind made me think I was someone else so I could stand myself at that. That's, I
Yeah.
think, the best way that I could
Yeah.
explain it. So after that,
Yeah.
for several years after that, I began to think that I was somebody else. And
Wow.
until
Yeah.
I could get to that point to deal with the trauma of
Yeah.
just those teachings of that, to feel safe. I guess it was a form of disassociation or something, because
Yes.
to
Yeah.
get to the point to be safe, to come back in my body into, I guess, my sense of self. And
Yeah.
so with realizing that, oh, I'm gay in this environment, they say that being gay is a choice, well, they're wrong and I'm not choosing this, that was a big questioning point for me.
I'm sure.
And
Yeah.
so I was like, oh wow, like if they're wrong about this,
Mhm.
so I was like, oh, they're either wrong or they're lying. That's what I thought in my mind.
Right.
and
Yeah.
and then that made me think, like, what else are they wrong about?
Yeah.
And but I was also still so terrified of questioning and still worried, like, oh, like what is God
Yeah.
going to do to me? What are the
Yeah.
consequences? And what will my family think? What will they do to me? If, like, I was terrified of my family
Yeah. Yeah.
finding out.
Yeah. That going back to that and that image that you used of the split,
Yeah.
I think it's so I mean, it's just wild to me, like in the coolest way that you were so like aware of that happening. Even if you couldn't put those words on
Oh, I
there,
did not have the words. No.
but you were like, I'm kind of moving into this other kind of part of myself essentially for survival. And one of the modalities of therapy that I do a lot, it's called trauma informed stabilization techniques. It used to be called structural dissociation model. And I use it with complex trauma because the woman who teaches this, she talks a lot about like how trauma lives in the body of a
Mm.
complex trauma survivor.
Yeah.
And it's a form of like a dissociative identity disorder. It's not full blown like we
Yeah.
might see in some other cases, but it is this recognition that you have to fragment or split off parts of yourself
Yeah.
in order to survive this overwhelming, consistent, persistent threat
Yeah.
environment.
Yeah.
And I mean, in my experience with working with so many religious trauma survivors, that diagnosis really fits not as a way to pathologize people, but as a way to help to understand that your mind and body literally was like, we have to cut off parts of ourselves or fragment large chunks of who we are so that we can survive in this
Uh,
situation. And it's just like, it's wild to see like how you like intuitively did that, even though you weren't consciously putting words to it. It was just like your body knew this is what we have to do for
mm,
survival.
yes. And could you say what that term is again? I'm curious.
Yeah.
It's
So the modality that I'm talking about.
yes.
So they changed the name of it because insurance companies don't
Oh,
like when you say you're doing dissociation work. So
yeah.
it's called trauma informed stabilization techniques,
Okay.
TIST. And the
Okay.
woman who I've done my teacher has taught me, her name is Janina Fisher, and she's what I imagine Santa Claus's wife would sound like. Mrs. Claus. She's just very, very sweet,
Yeah.
but she just is a phenomenal educator and therapist. And that whenever I read her work for the first time, which was probably 10 or so years ago, I was like, oh, this exactly describes me. This exactly
Oh,
describes so many of the people that I work with
yeah.
because you just have to you like live in just a tiny fragmented part of
Yeah.
yourself, and healing is
Oh,
all about
yes.
reintroducing and reintegrating
Yes.
those parts of yourself that you've had to fragment.
Oh my gosh. No, I'm
Yeah.
so glad you said that, because I really love internal family systems.
Yes, it's
That
like
has helped
internal
me.
family systems on steroids. That's what
Oh,
this modality is.
I
Yeah.
can't wait to look into that
Yeah,
then, because I
yeah.
love internal family systems. That is
Yeah.
something that was so helpful for me.
Mhm.
Oh my goodness. But yeah, I'm not sure if you had questions or anything
No,
else you
I just
wanted.
wanted to say that, but just like how
Yeah.
brilliant, like
Mm,
again, that resilience piece, but just I think it's so common, and I think then when you add the sexuality piece on top of it, it just breaks my heart
Yeah.
to hear the way that
Mm.
you were thinking because it's so devastating.
Yeah.
And you understand, I mean, we know that people in the LGBTQ community already have a higher rate of like suicidal ideations and
Yeah.
things like that, but then
Mm.
to put the religious piece on top of it, of like this creator God and these spiritual authorities,
Yeah.
like I just like, my heart breaks.
Yeah.
Like, you
Thank
should have
you.
never had to go through that.
Thank you for
Nobody
saying
should.
that. No, no one at all. And yeah, I mean, it was definitely something that just automatically, I think, yeah, did happen in my mind, like you said, like it just like I love this is I always love my interviews with therapists. Y'all are so great with helping us survivors really process and just
Oh,
validate and just
yeah.
think about these things. And like that, because the language is
Mhm.
so important
Yeah,
into
yeah.
understanding experiences and framing that. So then, you can begin a path of like knowing how to deal with that or heal or
Yes.
become whole again or get in touch
Yeah.
with who you are.
Uh,
And I remember moments, when that was happening where
mm.
I would literally look in the mirror and I'd be like, oh, that's who I am. Like I would forget. Like that's just
Wow.
how disassociated and
Wow.
fragmented I was with that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm. Wow, thank you for sharing that.
Hmm.
As we kind of are moving through your story, you have all these questions as an adolescent growing, into high school and things like that. And you're trying to decide, are they lying or am I really, this
Mm.
huge sinner that can't get rid of this
Yeah.
major sin in my life, right? How did that start to translate into I should go to a super strict Bible college?
Yeah. So I think in the last episode, I talked about how finding the term spiritual abuse, I think that was around 17. That
Yes.
was
Hmm.
after I experienced this depression and that disassociation.
Hmm.
After that, it started. And really finding that term was like a catalyst. And
Mm.
it was the point where, there was such an internal struggle with
Yeah.
wanting to leave, but terrified of
Yeah.
leaving
I get that.
and so conflicted. And finding that term was so helpful for me because it finally validated for the first time that you're not the problem. This system is the
Yeah.
problem, which
Hmm.
in that environment, the system could never be at fault. It was always put on you. If you're seeing good results from the system, it's them as the system, but if it's not working, then it's you. So it's
Yeah.
so interesting
So
how,
convenient. Yeah. For
yeah,
them.
how that works.
Yeah.
And so I was terrified. I wanted to leave, but I was terrified of leaving and still had so much more to unpack it. The ideology and the indoctrination had such a hold on my mind. And so I was like, okay. And I felt so I didn't I at that time I was like, do I even have the strength or ability or even resources
Yes.
to leave
Yes.
amongst all this the
Yeah.
psychological hold it had on me. So for me, I was like, I'm going to get out through going to Bob Jones
Yeah.
University, which is
I
insane to
love it.
even think about because
Yeah.
for me, I was like, how can I get out?
Mhm.
And all these Christian colleges that were in the fundamentalist circles did not have legitimate degrees or legitimate accreditation.
Right.
So
Mhm.
you were still stuck in that system. You get hired within that
Mhm.
system. And Bob Jones was that exception because they had, when I was looking into it, they had legitimate accreditation. And so for me, I was like, if they have legitimate accreditation, I can get a job in the outside world.
Mhm.
And even, while I'm there at Bob Jones, I can try to build these life skills that were so underdeveloped from living such an isolated,
Wow.
because
Yeah.
that was something I realized too, was just, oh my God, just the social development. Oh, yikes. Like that was
Yeah.
even later in my teen years, I could just tell like, oh my gosh, like if I can't learn how to interact or work with people, I'm
Mhm.
never. And so before I went to Bob Jones, working at Chick-fil-A was kind of like my first kind of, which is still a Christian
I love it.
conservative
I love it.
organization, so it's whatever, but
But it's stepping stones,
it's a
right? Like
stepping
you
stone.
have to take what you can. I love that
Yes.
this is part of your story. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I worked at Chick-fil-A and it did I took a lot of skills from that. I met a lot of great people. And I think there is some trauma for that because that really took advantage of my perfectionist and performance
I'm
based
sure.
issues.
Yes.
Definitely. That's very much ingrained in that culture also. That's a whole other area.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I love the people I met and what I learned. And so I was like, yeah, going to Bob Jones, which I was so conflicted about because if I really could have chosen a college, I don't think I would have gone to a Christian or fundamentalist college.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, but anyway, so yeah, so I was like in my mind, Bob Jones is my way out. Once I
Wow.
graduate, I can
Yeah.
then walk away.
I don't know if you know this, but that was what Liberty University was for me.
Oh,
Also, I went there for my master's degree and I was like, this is my way out because I
wow.
had a degree in Christian ministry. And as a woman, like
Mm.
the only place that I'm hireable is a church and it has to be a large church. And, there's only so far you can go up.
Oh my
And I
gosh.
was like, I need to get another degree. And that's but I wasn't ready to go to a secular university. So I
Mm.
chose Liberty because they were credentialed. And I was like, this will be my ticket out is having a degree in something that I can then get a job in the outside world doing whatever I want to do. Which
Mm.
I never knew that we shared that
Yeah,
before. That's
that
amazing.
is
Yeah.
amazing. And
Yeah.
like it is, I think it also communicates how like how they keep people trapped in that system
Yes.
and the
Yeah.
links to do to get out. And I hate
Mhm.
that, for example, going to Bob Jones or going to these Christian colleges, there's so much blame I've noticed on the students who attend, like,
Yes.
oh, and I was just like, you don't understand. We're literally coming out of this coercive, controlling system that is very difficult, purposely set up to make it very difficult to leave.
Right.
And so
Mhm.
I wish people would be like, oh, let's try to understand what these systems are doing to people then. Oh, like why didn't you leave? It's like the
Right.
abusive
Yeah.
relationship thing that
Exactly.
people would say that's so awful. Like, oh, why didn't you
Yeah.
leave? And it's like, okay, well, how about we hold the abuser accountable or see what they're doing to control people?
Right. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, exactly.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
So Bob Jones was the beginning of the end. I know that, but I want to hear your story of that because I think it's fascinating that you got kicked out. You're my hero for that.
Uh,
But what led to that? I mean, I know it was a very long and drawn out story, but whatever you feel comfortable sharing because I
yeah.
know it's so pivotal to
Ooh,
getting you to who you are today.
yes. Yeah. So I was at Bob Jones for 3.5 years.
Mm.
Definitely a lot. A lot of still questioning that system. And it was really at Bob Jones, looking back, it was a way for me to test the reality I had been told. It was
Mhm.
like, let's start to break these rules and see what's going to happen to me.
Mhm. Love
And
it.
yeah, I know. Because at that time, and I think another thing that pushed me to go to Christian college was I was still terrified of going against what my parents wanted. Like,
Right,
you were taught
right.
to never go out from under that authority or you would be open up to harm. And so I was like, okay, if I stay within this system, I can get out eventually and, I'll be safe for now as I work on undoing this,
Mm.
even while I'm in the midst of it
Yeah.
daily. And so I remember that first semester, I tried to follow all of their rules perfectly, but my mental health was just kept declining. Just, the
Wow.
trauma from my past, being a queer student at this university, dealing with harassment from other people on like guys on campus who were very aware that I was different. Just all these things, trying to again perform, follow these rules, not cause a rift. And that's an interesting thing. Like for me, like I was always a people pleaser. I was always a perfectionist,
Yeah.
follow the rules, goody two shoes, and felt when you're like that, people praise you for that, and you're set as this
Yes.
example,
Mhm.
and which can be hard when you're questioning that and want to break away the pressure from that also. But as I'm going through the system, I'm like, let me begin to go against authority. This
Yeah.
entire life, obey, 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 obey authority. Don't go under from authority. You disobey, horrible things are going to happen to you,
Wow.
whatever. And I just slowly, it was so serious then, but I laugh about it now.
Mhm.
And I remember the first time for me, I'm trying to remember, I think, oh, yes, okay. So my experience of skipping church for the first time, and this is a story I tell a lot, skipping church at Bob Jones was I slept in one morning and they cleared out the dorms at a certain time to make sure you're at church, and they would search the rooms. And I remember hearing the doors opening and closing as this residence assistant is checking all the rooms. And I'm at the top of the bunk and I'm just kind of like frozen there. And I was like, he's checking the rooms. I was like, what do I do? Like if I get caught, like they're
Yeah.
gonna be just watching me so much. And so
Mhm.
I slid against the wall between the mattress and the bed and I covered myself up and he came
That's
and
incredible.
he walked in and I was just so silent and I
Mm.
was just terrified. And then, he shut the door and I waited a few moments because I'm like, I was just obsessive. Like maybe he pretended to shut the door and he's waiting me to come out or something. I was just so terrified. And so I
Mhm.
waited and I got up and he was gone. And like the adrenaline rush from that, I was like, oh my gosh, I just hid from an RA and I disobeyed this rule and they don't know. And I got away with this. Like it was
You are such a rebel.
oh my God, it's so ridiculous looking back, but then it was just so
Mhm.
serious. And then to
Mhm.
me to eat, you had to submit your attendance online, and they did that through the honor system. You just told them you attended, and they would send people to churches to check sometimes too. But I lied about that too. I was like, yeah, I went to this church at this time, and like that was like that was scary to me. Like I had so much anxiety. I'm like, they're gonna find out, or I'm gonna be
Yeah.
punished in some way by God, or something's gonna happen, or blah blah blah. And as I continued to break rules, and even just, I wasn't like really bad. Like it was just not going to church
Yeah, it was
and
being an adult,
being an
making your
adult.
own choices.
Yes.
Yeah.
And like, oh, listening to the music that I wanted to listen to
Right.
and
Mhm.
secretly like watching, TV off their Wi-Fi and whatever and like deleting the history and then reconnecting and like all the things I had to do. It was so because of the
Wow.
surveillance
Yeah.
culture. But as I continued to do that, I mean, I had several breakdowns when I
Mhm.
was at Bob Jones. There was this time my freshman year, very, very suicidal. I was just, well, I was around so many people, but I
Mhm.
felt so alone.
Yeah.
I might
Yeah.
as well have just been like, I just felt so lonely, so isolated, and not knowing that I was really dealing with trauma. And of
Mhm.
course, like being queer in this environment, just all these things compounding on top of another. And at that point, I was like, I was still so, there were so many conflicting things because I wanted to leave, but I was still so scared of the outside world. I just
Yeah.
remember being
Yeah.
told that, they are controlled by Satan. They don't have any love in their hearts. They're
Mhm.
devoid of anything good
Yeah.
inside them. And so it was just, there was still such a hole, but still not wanting to believe that. But it's just, it got to the point where, one of the reasons I think I was so suicidal was just the harm and I experienced in that and that mental health issues, and then being told that, oh, we're the ones who have love,
Mhm.
being
Yeah.
told, and that there's nothing better than this.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so when you're in an environment that doesn't give you those options, that makes you believe that you're hopeless outside that system, but yet you're hopeless in it already, it
Mhm.
makes you feel like there's no hope at all. And I think that's one of the
Yeah.
things that contributed to that. And so after like I was able to deal with that situation, I was like, I have to explore outside of this environment.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so, for example, yes, I was skipping church, which was actually it was good for my mental health, but I did need community. I needed genuine human
Right.
belonging and
Yeah.
community and
Yeah.
connection. And so I remember after that situation, I am surprised that I even did this at this time, but I journaled and I was like, what do I need?
Wow.
What do I need? Like,
You are like an old soul for real. Like, I mean, I feel like most people don't start asking that question until they're 40 or something, you know?
oh my God, that's fine. And so, because it was just insane, because
Yeah.
I was just like, what is like,
Wow.
I couldn't quite see it then because I didn't have the language, but there were some things I did realize, of course, that were affecting me. but sometimes you
Yeah.
don't know what you're experiencing until you talk to someone about it, or you even just like
Yeah.
write it down and,
Mm.
process it outside of yourself, getting that out of your
Yeah.
mind into
Yeah.
something tangible. And so when I wrote down what I needed, community was something that came up a lot. And I was like, oh, well, this doesn't feel like community. I don't think I can find community on this campus. Where can I find that? And I was like, oh, at a
Yeah.
progressive, affirming church. But that was still something that was the idea of that was scary to me because, again, it's like you're
Mhm.
going down this destructive path. Like, once you stray away,
Yeah.
it's a slippery slope. But at that point, I was like, if I don't get that community, if I don't get out of the system or find something different, like
Yeah.
well, not, I'll take my own life in it. Like, it's either like I'm going to die in this
Yeah.
system or I find something in the
Yeah.
outside. Like,
Yeah.
that's what was in my mind at the time of what I felt like that there was no way I could live in that
Yeah.
environment. So I had to try. And so, long story short, I ended up going to this very progressive, affirming church, and I met a family there, told them a bit about my situation, and they lived right across the street from Bob Jones. And so once they started to get to know me, they gave me a key to their house, and I would go to their house. Even just when they weren't there, they're like, you can come anytime. And just
Wow.
having that
Yeah.
relief
Yeah.
of not being in that environment, it really made me realize the
Wow.
impact that it had on me. And I was
Mhm.
like, oh my gosh, like this,
Wow.
it was like a breath of fresh air to go to their
Yeah.
house
I
and
can
be
imagine.
actually safe. And then, I would have dinners with
Mm.
them and just started building a relationship with them. And so through those years, they were like my safe haven. So I continued. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
incredible. I love that
Yeah.
they were part of my story. And so as I
Yeah.
continued on, I it became easier and easier to work the system and survive.
Yeah. Wow.
And
Feel free to share examples if you want of like when you say work the system. I feel like people will find that fascinating because, I think we might have mentioned this the last episode. Like there's uh, I think Bob Jones or like Pensacola Christian can get these raps of like, oh, they're these like super fundamentalist schools with all these ridiculous rules or whatever. But I think what a lot of people don't realize is many Christian universities have the same rules or maybe just a tiny bit less severe. And so I think that this idea of like people having to figure out ways to work around it is actually pretty common,
yeah,
but nobody really talks about it because it's terrifying, right? It's like,
yeah.
no, I have to still, say that I lived by this code of conduct. So,
Mm,
yeah, if you feel like sharing any more little workarounds,
oh,
I'm sure people would love to hear it.
yeah. So, for example, with working the system, so with skipping church, I would always like figure out like how, because in these systems, conformity and schedule routine are such a thing. And
Yeah.
if you break that routine or that schedule, someone is going to notice. So I was like, okay, how can I skip church? Oh, well, I can't just sleep in Sunday
Mhm.
mornings and hide in my closet. Some days I did do that,
Yeah.
but I knew I couldn't do that every single week. So yeah, I would sometimes hide behind my hamper in my closet when they check the room.
Oh, like it's so bittersweet. Like I think it's hilarious, and it's also so sad that you had to do that. Like you're
Yeah.
this adolescent, young adult kid who's like, I have to hide because they're gonna make me do something I don't want to do.
Yeah, I know it. And
Wow.
I also said, oh, well, I can't be on my computer or my phone or, during this
Yeah.
time when I'm not at
Wow.
church because they could see that too. So it was just
Wow.
constantly trying to think of all the ways like Big
Mhm.
Brother or whatever, Bob
Yeah.
Jones was watching me.
Wow.
And I would also, some weeks, I would get shorts on a t-shirt. Then I would get my dress pants over my shorts and a dress shirt over my t-shirt and then a coat or whatever. And then I try to remember because I think I had like a string like backpack that I would put like in my coat. And so then I would go off campus and then put these clothes in this bag. And I would usually go to a local park and just enjoy nature and just swing and have
Wow.
fun and go to
Yeah.
walk the trails. And
Oh,
then I
yeah.
was like, oh, I have to go back by this time. Okay, let me go into, the park restroom, get back on my church clothes. Now let me go walk for a mile and a half back to the school.
Andrew, oh my gosh, bless your heart. Like,
Yes. And
I don't
then
mean that in a disparaging way,
I know
just
what you
like,
mean.
wow. Wow.
let me go. And so you were allowed to be back on campus at 11:30 a.m. because that is when the dining hall opens. So I would make sure I was walking back on that campus right at 11
Wow.
a.m.
Hmm.
and go to get my food in my church clothes, looking like I had
You,
gone
yeah,
there.
just been worshiping God.
Yeah.
Actually, but you kind of had been in your own way, you know?
Nature. Oh my God.
Yes.
Yes. I love that. Yeah. Actually resting on Sunday. Wow. Who knew?
Yeah. Oh, what a novel concept. Oh
Yeah.
my gosh.
And
Yeah.
so other ways of playing the system, like for listening to music or watching movies,
Hmm.
just disconnecting from their Wi-Fi. I would just disconnect from their Wi-Fi and they couldn't
Hmm.
track that. And I would like always like clear the history and everything once
Hmm.
I connected back on, just any like digital traces back to what I did. I know it was insane with that. And then I'm trying to think of other rules that I wrote because sometimes I just don't even think
Yeah.
about it. It's just like I would
Yeah.
always know where like who my RA was, and I would like see what he was wearing that day, and I'd be like, okay, I know what you look like today, or what you're wearing, and I'm gonna avoid you. And oh, I'm never gonna walk through the middle entrance of the dorm because you're always gonna be sitting there, and I just want you to forget I exist. Yeah,
Wow. Yeah. I mean, as sad as it is to like
yeah,
know that you had to navigate that, again,
yeah,
it's that like resilience factor. Like you figured out like I have to survive. And so
yeah.
even these little ways of like which door to walk through is going to increase my chance of surviving this
Oh my
environment,
God,
which is
yes.
like
It
unbelievable.
is unbelievable. And
Yeah.
someone did, a teacher saw me walking off campus and they approached me in class and they were just very like, it was like friendly, but that kind of mix of like passive aggressive friendly, that
Yeah.
southern,
Hmm.
like, I don't know how to describe it, but
Yeah.
it was just like, he's like, oh, I saw you walking yesterday. And this was a Monday. It's like, oh, yesterday was Sunday. He's like, I saw you walking. Like, do you walk a lot? And I was like, oh, yeah, I enjoy
Yeah.
walking. When
Yeah.
things are stressful, I walk. And like, yeah. It's just like, what do you want me to like? What do you want me to say? Like,
Right. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it was just like this look in his eyes of like I caught you. And so after that, I then was followed. I know of at least one time followed off campus by a dorm
Wow.
supervisor,
Okay.
and a second time. This was freshman year. A second time, I was followed off campus at night by an RA. And I know about this. Well, the first time I saw the dorm supervisor following me, and I would take all these back roads to get him from. And I was just walking. He was walking on the road or on the sidewalk with his wife, and so I went off the sidewalk into all these different roads to get away with him. And everywhere I went, they were
He was
behind me,
there. Oh my
always.
gosh.
And so once I got around a corner, I like ran back to campus
Mhm.
and I was like, because I didn't want them to know the park that I was going to, my safe place. And like, if there, like 10 minutes later,
Wow.
there they were walking back on campus to where I
Mhm.
was. So I was like, okay, I'm like, he was definitely following me. The second time, the RA came to my room and said, oh, I saw that you walked here, blah, blah, blah. And it was night. And it was, I mean, I did walk in like probably not the best situations at night to get away from there, but it was just like, there were like no street lights or
Yeah.
anything, very dark neighborhood that I walked through. I was like, how did you see me walking through all these dark neighborhoods
Yeah.
unless you were there? Follow. So anyway,
Yes.
so that was another time. So like, oh my gosh, they're following me. So there were times of
Yeah.
like, oh no, I wasn't always working the system the best, but they still didn't get me in. Like it wasn't enough to like get me in trouble. They were definitely looking for
Right.
something to get me in trouble for. And so as time went on, as I noticed when I moved to the dorm to a new dorm the next year, it felt like it was a reset for me because it was like, okay, like the sing leaders are not above me. I can start fresh with these people, and they don't seem to be watching me the same as they were at least last year.
Mhm.
And so, and then part of it too was not trusting people. Not, I mean, you couldn't trust
Yeah.
people. They set
No.
up a
Yeah.
tattletale kind of system where
Yeah.
you had to tell on someone if you saw them breaking the rules or knew of them, and if you didn't, you were just as guilty as them. So it's just very like spy culture
Yeah.
that they created.
Yeah.
And so it was like, oh, don't get close to people. And it was still, it was just so isolating. And just wearing this mask, wearing this persona to survive. There was one moment when someone asked me where I went to church. I was like, oh, and I told them that what I had been putting on my list, and they were like, oh, this person. I know goes to the church, and they haven't mentioned you being there. That's interesting. And I'm like, oh, that's so weird. I'm like, I sit in the back a lot, it's just, it was just one of those, just a very low key person. But it was just, and it became such a habit of just all
Yeah.
these ways of breaking the rules. And even just, oh, a friend of mine that's a girl has a car. Oh, well, I'm going to get in the car in the front seat with her. I don't care. Like, it's just, and I didn't get caught for that, thankfully.
Yeah. You weren't lusting after her
No,
anyways.
definitely
You're
not.
fine.
Yeah, it's so funny. Yes. And yeah, so it was just like, yeah, definitely like not, I couldn't share people about I was breaking all these rules. I had to look like I was doing all the things that I wanted to do. Now, some things I couldn't break out of, like, chapel, they were taking attendance for that. I think originally they had cameras where they could see if you didn't sit in your seat
Yeah.
and they would mark you. And then eventually it was scanning your card, and that's what they
Wow.
switched to. Yeah, so there were some required activities I could not get out of, but eventually, like, that's what I had to do to survive that system. And
Yeah.
at that time, as I was still struggling with my sexuality, it got to the point. I think it was a breakdown I had my junior year. And long story short, I had a breakdown, spilled my guts to this dorm supervisor, didn't care if I was getting kicked out, like, oh, I'm gay, I've been in this
Yeah.
environment, and blah, blah, blah. Spill these things out to him, and basically was like, oh, I'm suicidal. I was sharing with him all these things. And then he's like, oh, I see how you've been paying for your sin. That's what he says. Yeah, I'm like, thank
Wow.
you. Thank you so much. And then I basically was telling him, I was like, I don't even know if I believe this stuff at all.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and then since I said that, he was like, "Oh, well, I cannot help you," because he was a biblical, I guess considered a biblical. I don't think he was really a biblical counselor, but in that biblical counseling model, like they're not supposed to counsel anyone who doesn't at least say they align with the beliefs. And
Yeah.
so he was like, "I can't do anything." And I don't even remember if they even like checked on me after that, or I don't know. I can't quite remember if they did or not, but it was like, yeah, I can't really help you. And even though that was so traumatic and awful for him to even like do that,
Yeah.
just to get that out and say that to him was
Yeah.
actually
Yeah.
really helpful,
I'm
despite how awful he
sure.
was about it. But
Yeah.
but then it was
Yeah.
like, and they didn't, and because I hadn't been acting on those desires, or that's what they would say, acting on those desires, I
Right.
was not
Yeah.
kicked out. And I had a clean record. Like, I didn't admit to breaking any of the rules at all. So I had a
Good.
very, he's like, wow, he's like, you have a very clean record. Like, yeah. So, and I hadn't
Yeah.
caught us any issues. And so he was fine with me staying. And, I was not going to be kicked out at that point. So, long story short, you know, just struggling so much mentally, I had I'm doing this in air quotes, reconversion experience at Bob Jones my junior year. I was just
Yeah.
so desperate,
Yeah.
and they use love and fear together so much to manipulate. And there was just one sermon where it was just all love and just all consuming, and there wasn't that usual fear that was used. And so it just felt incredible. It was just like, I need
Mm.
something. And so I had that reconversion or whatever experience. And then, which I don't know, I don't know, maybe was that the fourth one? I don't know. I don't know how many
Yeah.
times I had just gotten resaved or whatever. But it was after that, like, yes, I got that emotional high, but it wore off very quickly.
I'm sure.
And
Yeah.
that's when I
Yeah.
realized, I was like, oh my gosh, like, that is not, like,
Yeah.
okay, wow, like, this isn't real.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah.
whatever. That was just, yeah, I didn't know. I don't know how I
Yeah.
thought about it at that time. I was like, oh, like that was just my emotions, and I was just so desperate.
Wow.
And but I already told this guy, oh, I got saved or whatever. And so then he agreed, oh, you got saved. Okay, let's do discipleship.
Wow.
And so we did
Yeah.
discipleship that eventually started and began to turn into conversion therapy to change. Yeah. So so
Yeah.
once it changed into that, it was one session of like the official conversion therapy,
Yeah.
and I don't even remember the session. I remember like walking through that door and leaving, but I
Mm.
don't remember anything that
Yeah.
happened in that room. But afterwards, I felt just so suicidal, and it was like going downhill mentally again. And there was that
Yeah.
voice of like, you cannot do this. And that was something
Yeah.
for me. I had, I'm an INFJ. So like intuition is like very strong for me. But when that intuition went against the system, I always interpreted it as Satan or something wrong.
Right.
But as I got older, I was like, no, like this is something I have to lean into more. And that was a moment of that. And that's when I ended things with him like, oh, I'm not meeting with you anymore. This is really harmful. This is damaging
Mhm.
to me. And the good thing is, I need to go back to this, but I did end up recording this discipleship lessons. And I didn't know I recorded the first therapy
Oh,
session or the conversion therapy, but I found on my phone, it's like
oh my
first conversion
gosh.
therapy session, like 1 hour, something minutes. And I
Wow.
was like, oh, fuck, I don't know if I will ever
Wow.
listen to that or, oh my God, that's,
That would be a lot for sure. That would be
yeah.
really hard, I
Yeah,
would
that would
think.
be very hard
Yeah.
to listen to. So again,
Wow.
here I am really, you know, going against that authority, which is so hard. And so
Yeah.
eventually I was like, I'm leaving for sure. I'm tired of this back and forth that
Yeah.
is just going on. Oh, I'm staying, I'm not, or I'm believing I'm not. Like it's just this internal. I was like, I'm just breaking away. And so that summer after my junior year, I was like, we're going to read all kinds of books, atheist books, that is just going to destroy,
Yeah, everything.
obliterate, just destroy all of this, all these teachings and things that they, have told me. And so, and for me, the inerrancy of the Bible, questioning the authority of the Bible was a big deal. And once at that time, you had to believe that it was inerrant to even be a Christian. So it's like, oh, if I
Yeah,
destroy that, the inerrancy thing, then it all just falls apart.
it does. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And
So
so
you
at
fell apart.
yeah, it fell apart definitely. And so because that was a requirement to be in that system. And I know
Right.
other faiths don't require that, but for them that was such a big deal to it.
Yeah.
And so after that, I think I had also found, so before I got to Bob Jones, spiritual abuse was the term that I found. Then religious
Right.
trauma. I think it was that summer I found the term religious trauma, and that was another term that I was
Yeah.
like, oh, it was just so eye opening to me as I read all the symptoms.
Wow.
And then, it talked
Yeah.
about complex PTSD symptoms, like it's
Mhm.
similar to that of it with the
Yeah.
religious component or in the religious
Mhm.
environment. And I was like, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
like this system has just
Yeah.
traumatized me so much.
Wow.
And so
Yeah.
long story short, that senior year, I was a film major originally, and then I switched to photography. So I was photography towards the end. I think it was visual studies, photography minor, and I was like, I'm going to make a photo series that is unpacking. Like it's just going to be a way for me to unpack my religious trauma.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
the series is this man that is just locked away in this room, trapped in this religious environment, experiencing a lot of harm, and he's locked in the room, but he has a key around him, and he doesn't know what the key is for. He doesn't know what a
Yeah.
key is, that it can unlock the door. And so I think when I was
Yeah.
making it, that represented autonomy and
Yeah.
choice, and like,
Oh,
I don't know,
yeah.
I think autonomy is probably what I was going with that. But he realized like and as he's like deconstructing, the room around him is cracking and breaking, so this
Yeah.
reality,
Yeah.
or environment that I was so like trapped in, locked in, I was,
Yeah.
and that it was causing me harm, I was breaking out of it, it was breaking away, and at the end the person has the key and they unlock the door and they
Yeah.
leave, and that was my me expressing that journey of that. And so I was like, I want to share this publicly. And it was just something that at first I was like, is this crazy? Like, should I really do this publicly? Like my last year at Bob Jones.
Yeah.
But there's that part of me that was like, you never wanted this life. You didn't want this
Yeah.
environment. It was a way to get out. And so
Yeah.
I would do it. And I knew that Josh Harris, he did interviews on his Instagram live at the
Yeah.
time. It was called Every Story Matters, I think.
Yes. I know. I was on one
Oh,
of
that's
them. Yeah.
right. Oh my gosh, that's
I
right.
can't believe. Yeah, that's it. And I remember he had you on, right?
Yes, he did have me on. And so I
Yeah.
did it. And the day I did the interview with him, it was a day before heading back to my last semester to Bob Jones University.
Wow.
And
Okay.
so anyway, so at that time, when I told my story, I shared what I had processed at that time. Because I mean, I've been really
Yeah.
processing out loud for several years now doing this.
Yeah.
And, through that photo series, that's what I shared in the language that I had found at that time to help describe those
Yeah.
experiences. And it was just, that was the first time I feel like anyone ever listened to me and saw me. Like at that connection of like someone saw me, heard me, and understood me. And it was
Wow.
just so healing, liberating, empowering to do that. And I was
That's
like,
incredible.
and like after that, it was just, it just all, and there was still trauma to deal with, of course, but just that beginning of like being
Yeah.
heard, it was just a catalyst for me to embark, I think, on that healing journey and leaving. And so 2 weeks later after that interview, I was expelled from Bob Jones University.
Wow.
And yeah, it was at night, 7 p.m. They didn't tell me I needed to come in for a meeting. My dorm supervisor knocks on the door and says, "Oh, you have to come in a meeting right now." And the people that were going to meet with me, one of them was that guy who did that counseling or whatever with
Yeah.
me, and this other guy who I had not heard good things about either. And so basically, they were like, they tried so hard to make small talk, and I'm just like, I just wasn't fucking with it. I was like, I know why we're here. And he was like, "Oh, is there anything you want to say about what you said in this interview?"
Mhm.
And I was just taken aback by that. I'm like, "Is there anything you want me to address? Because I stand by everything
Yeah.
I said in that, and I don't take back any
Oh
of
my
it."
gosh, amazing. Look at
Yes,
you.
it felt so good to say that. And he was just like turned red, and he was just like, "Oh, okay." So it was like I think 15 to 20 minute meeting, very fast.
Yeah.
Like it was just like, and it was interesting because I say kicked out, but I was kicked out. But how they get around it is they force students to withdraw, so they don't
Mm.
get in
Yeah.
trouble for certain things. So it was such a last second thing. There were so many emotions at that time for me. Like I'm like I will sign anything
Right.
to get
Just get
out
me
of
out
this
of here.
place.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
they were like, "Here are these papers you need to sign of withdrawing."
Mhm.
And yeah, I signed it. And
Wow.
if that felt really good
I
that,
bet. It-
to sign in and
Yeah.
say I'm leaving.
Mhm.
And yeah, and it was funny because they said, usually when we kick out students, we have them stay with a leader in the room and they're watched over until they leave. But we basically was like, "You're actually a nice guy, so we're not gonna do you basically. You're actually like a good guy."
Yeah, like they're not a flight risk essentially.
Yeah, and so they were just like what, and I think they were worried about the
Yeah.
influence that I had, like if they did anything more or whatever, that what I would say. And
Yeah.
I still made a podcast about them because
Yeah.
at that time, like even then people were like, "Oh, that was so horrible they did that to you." But to me, I didn't see that, I guess. I was like,
Sure.
"Oh,
Yeah.
wow, like how kind of them to not have someone watching over me all the time. How gracious." Like I just didn't have still
Yeah.
the experience to know like, oh wow, that's still to know what's normal or what's healthy or not.
Right.
But yeah, I ended up moving with that family that I
Yeah.
met there, and I still remember that day moving
Yeah.
and just like looking back as like we were driving away
Yeah.
and just like wow, like it was so surreal, and it was like wow, I
Wow.
am leaving. I am
Mhm.
finally leaving. It's finally
Yeah.
happening. Yeah.
Yeah. You used the key and you walked
Yes.
out. Yeah. Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
Andrew, you have such an incredible story. And I
Oh,
know
thank
like
you.
we've only touched on like the
I
ice,
know.
like the tip of the iceberg, right?
Yeah.
Like there's so much more, but it's just
Yeah.
it's fascinating. And I'm just, like I probably unfortunately am old enough to be your mom,
Oh,
but so I'm like but I feel like a big sister. I feel
oh,
like,
I love
like,
that.
oh, like you're my
Yeah.
little brother and I'm just
Oh.
like so impressed at the wisdom that you have and like you always have had that wisdom within you and it's
Mm.
like there's always this little part in you that's going like there's more like this isn't what it is all supposed to be and like we're gonna keep
Mm.
just like slowly peeling away like
Yeah.
Shawshank Redemption, right?
Yes.
Like slowly, get carving out that tunnel to get out and I just find it to be
Yeah.
so inspiring and
Oh.
incredible. I love
Thank
it.
you. No, thank you so much for
Yeah.
saying that. And I feel like, yeah, I feel like we're like siblings too. Like we're just so
Yeah.
close.
Yeah.
Like there's like soul connections or whatever, or
Yeah.
that you
I
find with
agree.
people that you just sense that. And that I have
Yeah.
found that so much. I think as I've gotten out of that system and met other survivors, it's just
Yeah.
a common thing I've seen is there was something different about us that caused
Yeah.
us, I think, to break away
Yeah.
from that
Yeah.
system that would
I
not
think
allow
it's
us to be in that.
yeah. It's like bravery or something because
Mm,
I talk to so many people who will say like it's like always been in me, like this little part of me that's like, I don't know, whether it's asking a question or being curious about other things or not feeling quite right. And I just think like the amount of bravery it takes to like let those questions actually bubble up to the
yeah.
surface, to ask them aloud, to like voice what is happening inside of you, that is not a doubting person, in the way
Yeah.
that churches talk about it. Like that's a weakness. Like that is an incredibly strong
Yeah.
person. And I just find it incredible that, like, literally for as long as you can remember, there was always that piece of you that was like, I'm not quite sure here. And you
Yeah.
let that like guide you. And it
Mm,
still is guiding
it
you.
is. It is.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. I mean, I know we're almost at time here, but like that was, a few years ago now, 4 years ago, three
I
years
think,
ago.
yeah, over 3 years ago now. Wow. It
Yeah.
feels so,
It feels so long though. Like
it
it feels like it's been
does.
so much longer because
It
I think I
does.
probably met you right at that
I
time.
think so.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. And you've been doing such incredible work in the deconstruction space and, religious trauma healing. But like give us a little preview of like what that healing has looked like for you.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely been non-linear.
Yeah.
That's one word I could describe it because
Yeah.
I remember going to my therapist and I'm like, here's all like, let me lay out my past for you in these like several sessions. All right, tell me what I need to do now.
Yeah.
And my therapist was just like,
It's like, oh shit. Yeah.
that therapist is like, he's like, let's talk about fundamentalism. He's like, what happened in fundamentalism? They gave you answers for everything. He's like, I'm
Mhm.
not here to do that. And it's even if there's not
Wow.
one answer, there's not answers for you. You
Yeah.
have to, get to a place where you can know for yourself and not basically be dependent on something outside of you. Basically, he was saying you need to learn to, grow that
Mhm.
internal sense of self and that
Yeah.
connection to self
I
to do
love
that.
that.
And so,
Yeah.
in the beginning of my healing journey, I think it was a good part of it. And I think it is important is the like self education for
Yeah.
me. So
Yeah.
learning about high control groups and cults, spiritual abuse, religious trauma, developmental
Mhm.
trauma, complex trauma, all these different things to
Yeah.
validate myself and help me understand. But learning about it wasn't going to heal it. Like the head knowledge was not
Mhm.
going to
Yeah.
connect me with my body, but it was good. It was
Yeah.
important. It was guides to help me. But I
Yeah.
had to, take that step to begin to do that.
Yeah.
And as I have been learning, I think expression has been such a key part, like creativity. I've
Yeah.
noticed that my photography, and even before I did photography, I was a film major at Bob Jones, for that filmmaking,
Mhm.
photography, podcasting, writing.
I love
Trauma
that.
does not belong in your body. It does
Yeah.
not belong there. And so expressing that has been a way to do that and getting in touch with my body, which has been so hard because I did not start really like feeling my body again until almost a year ago. That's when I
Mm.
finally came back into my body, and that
Wow.
was such a great experience, but it was also uncomfortable and scary. It was like, oh, I've been
Mm.
like away from
Mhm.
this body for so long. Here I am, and it's so uncomfortable, but it feels
Yeah.
good. It's like
Yeah.
getting used to a new pair of shoes or something.
Yes, that's a great way to put it. I love it. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah. Yeah.
so it was just, for my journey. There were times, and there will be, I think, times for everyone in the journey. There are times where the healing feels good, and other times the healing feels really awful,
Yeah.
and you feel like
Yeah.
you're going back, but know that you're not going back, and that
Yeah.
that journey, and like for me, I know it will be a lifetime of still unpacking so many things, but for me, internal family systems was so helpful for me because it taught me that there was a core self that was
Yeah.
good and that was
Mhm.
inside me. And I think
Yeah.
that was a belief that was so hard for me to get past, was the shame of there's nothing good in me. I'm still unworthy. I'm awful. And
Yeah.
so, using that model was helpful for me to know that there is a good part of me and to begin to learn to
Yeah.
trust that. And, I know my healing journey has definitely been way all over the place, because I noticed that once I left, I love the work that I've done and has been healing for me. But there have been times when I've done that from a place of trauma and disconnection of
Sure.
just do, do,
Yeah.
do, do, do. Oh,
Yeah.
I gotta do. And so there
Yeah.
have definitely been times learning to rest was the hardest thing. I think it was after the
Yeah.
Surviving Bob Jones podcast, I
Yeah.
just like fell on my ass and I was just like, oh my God, I am
Yeah.
exhausted.
Yeah.
And
I
eventually
bet.
got to the point where I was like, I have to rest. And that was a very difficult thing to
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
And right now, my current healing journey, right now, I've been learning to get in touch with some of the things I enjoyed as a child and just play.
Oh, I
Just
love that.
do coloring
Yeah.
books, play the
Yes.
guitar, go outside on a walk. Like, don't try and not
Yeah.
to focusing on experiencing. That is just
That's
something,
great.
in
Yeah.
tandem, of course, with therapy and processing. It will be a lifetime journey. But yeah, I'm trying to think of the
Yeah.
core thing I was going to say. But yeah, healing happens through the body. That is something that was so hard for me
Yeah.
to really understand, because I tried so hard through my mind, or
Yeah.
the intellectual
Yes.
part.
Yeah.
And so
Mhm.
it was like, okay, like and what was hard though, scary, is, I've had to relive memories
Yeah.
and release them and cry
Yeah.
and sob. And hypnotherapy
Yeah.
was something that was crucial, because I was so repressed. These feelings and emotions were
Yeah.
so repressed.
Yeah.
And at first, even my therapist said, he's like, I don't know if you need therapy. And he did apologize to me about that, because
Sure.
and I told him, and I was like, listen, I'm like, my life, I've had to pretend that I'm okay, that I'm perfect, that I'm,
Yeah.
performing well, putting on this face. But I'm like, trust me, underneath this, there's so much, there's a lot. And
Yeah.
once we started hypnotherapy, and he unlocked that,
Yeah.
so much came pouring out. And he was like,
Yeah.
oh, wow. And
Yeah.
so that began, dealing with those traumatic memories and tending to them, showing love and compassion to those parts and those experiences, and crying and expressing and getting that out, and
Yeah.
having compassion, knowing that, oh, this is a process. Like, this
Yeah.
is not going to happen. There's
Yeah.
no quick fix. Let's give
Yeah.
myself the love and compassion that I needed when I did experience these
Yeah.
things, and work through that inner child that needed that all along.
Oh, I mean, you are so lucky. I don't mean like in the weird way, but like I'm so glad that you are learning this right now. You have so many incredible years ahead of you, and you're
Yeah.
ahead of so many people in this. And not that
Yeah.
healing is like a race or something like
Yeah.
that. But I just think about like how many years of your life you get to live in that healing experience
Yeah.
instead of being trapped inside of these systems of
Mm,
oppression and abuse and control,
yeah.
and even the ones that we make for ourselves in order to survive. And like those are all things that are
Oh,
unlocked now in your life. And it's like, yeah, it sucks sometimes and
and
it's
this.
hard, but
Yeah.
like you have like your full adult life where you're like, I'm like living in the healing already, which is
Mm,
just incredible. And I'm
mm.
so excited for you.
No, thank you for saying that
Yeah.
so much. And, psychology is something that's always been, I do want to become a
Yeah.
therapist one day.
Yeah. You'd be
And
awesome at
thank
it.
you. It's something, after I finish my undergrad, I don't know when I'm going to do my
Yeah.
master's, but I want to do it from that healing space and
Yeah.
not that scarcity and that constantly doing. So
Right.
when the time is
Right.
right, I will embark on
Yeah.
that journey whenever it happens.
Absolutely.
But I'm excited for that.
Absolutely. Oh,
Yeah.
I'm excited for that too. And all
Yeah.
of your
Thank
future
you.
clients, they'll
Oh,
be so
thank you. I
lucky.
would love that. Yes.
I love it. So, all right, talk to the person who has been out of Bob Jones University one day. You know, like if you can speak to that person, what is one piece of advice or wisdom that you would want to give them?
Yeah. I mean, the advice that I would give, I think, to someone, yeah, who just got out of Bob Jones, I would say be gentle with yourself,
Mm,
which I know is it's really difficult. Like I say that I
yeah.
definitely wasn't gentle with myself at
Hmm.
all when I
Hmm.
came out of Bob Jones. But I would say be gentle with yourself
Yeah.
and be okay with not knowing, with not having the answers. And a big part of that when you leave, if you're like, who am I? Who am I if I'm not for this belief system has told me to be, or what my identity has been in this belief system and been in doing these things and following these rules. Identity is like reforming that identity is such a big part. It's something that I'm still working through definitely too, of like what is me and what was indoctrinated into me still and how that reflects in other areas. But what tune in, which again, like I could have never done this when I left Bob Jones, but I think learning to be, because like I overlooked this in the beginning, but I think it's so important to be still and
Mm.
know what is happening in your body.
Ooh, that
Listening.
is a lifelong lesson.
It
I love
is.
that you said
And
it, though. I love
I'm
it.
still learning it.
Yeah.
I'm still learning that to just
Yeah.
stop and be
Mm.
like, how does this person make me feel? And I think learning something that's a struggle too is it is okay to say no. It is okay to disappoint people.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was something that I've been better about that this year, but it's something that's been so hard for me to say no and
Hmm.
not people please.
Yeah.
But yeah, I
I
would say
get that.
yes, be still, listen to your body, be okay with not having the answers, and explore who you are. Like ask, like, what do I enjoy to do? Like if they did not tell me to
Mm-hmm.
serve in this ministry or do this role, like if I threw away this role and what they told me to be, who would I be? And
Mm-hmm.
just explore that in whatever way you
Yeah.
want to, daydream about it, think about it, because what I've learned getting out of fundamentalism, it is a system that is based on so much fear. And
Mm-hmm.
so the opposite, of course, obviously, like getting into love, true learning what love is, like that was something I had to unpack too. Like what is
Yes.
actual love, what is healthy?
Yes.
And
Hmm.
so internal family systems with the core self that they talk about, it has, can't remember all of them, but it has confidence, connection, creativity, compassion,
Yep.
clarity, like, connectedness,
Curiosity,
curiosity.
connectedness. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. The eight
So
C's. Yeah.
the eight C's. And so once I realized that, I was like, oh my gosh, fundamentalism was the exact opposite to me.
Yeah.
Connecting to myself is connecting to love, all these core
Mm.
aspects. So being curious, being creative, like learning and knowing what that is, knowing what healthy love is like, I
Mm.
think too is so, so crucial to healing
Oh,
from
I
that
love that.
environment. Yeah. And sorry,
Yeah.
that was a bit long answer,
Yeah.
but that's all
No, I mean,
to
I think
say.
all of it is so valid. And I
Yeah,
think, I think, yeah, to your point of like kind of like hitting the ground running. I mean, I remember when you were getting out of it and you were hitting the ground
I
running.
was.
And I remember thinking, oh, this guy's got passion and like, I hope he's going to be okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Because I knew that, I knew that you were in the middle of some really big stuff. But I think you're totally right with being gentle to yourself and really exploring what love is, because it's in so many cases the opposite. What we've been told love is the opposite actually of what
Yes.
love is. And
Hmm.
so there is so much, and there's so much time to be able to do that. Like
Yes.
I think it's so easy for us to like be like, all right, I've got to like do everything right now and like give me 3 months and I'll be healed, because you want to be, right?
You
Like you're
do.
like, I want to get out of this. But yeah, that just slow and steady pace is so beautiful. And I think too, like, because I've been able to see you through, several years now, like you just have so much more like peace about you. So there still is that fiery passion,
Yes.
but there is so much peace to you of
Yeah.
with who you are and your
Yes.
purpose and like
Uh,
what you're doing.
yeah.
And I just think that that's really really cool to see.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. That
Yeah.
really validates me a lot. And yeah, I definitely have looked back and I'm just like, wow, like I just, whoa, that was a lot. Damn.
It
But
was a lot. You were doing a lot back then.
I was.
Yeah. But you it turned out
It
okay. You're
did. I'm
like,
great
yeah,
now. No, yeah.
you're still
Yeah,
standing.
it's still. Oh my
I love
gosh.
it.
Yeah.
Well, I've really appreciated going deeper into your story. I am sure the listeners will appreciate it as well. You've mentioned a couple times podcasts, books, art, things like that. If people want to find out more about who you are, kind of follow your journey, get in touch with you or your work, what's the best way for them to find you?
Yeah, people can find me on social media at the handle Andrew Pledger Writes. And if people want to listen to my podcast about Bob Jones, Surviving Bob Jones University, it's a limited series, so it's over, but people can listen to that. And right now, my current podcast, which I've been on a break on since December, is called Beyond BJU, and it continues stories for people from Bob Jones affiliated ministries and also from the school too. So yeah,
Yeah.
there's episodes of that out for the first season who people who want to listen to that. But yeah, I think those are the main places that people can find me and see my
Wonderful.
work. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I will make sure to put all of that in the show notes so that people
Yeah.
can follow along and see all the incredible things that
Oh,
you're doing. Thank you so much for being a part of this today, Andrew. It is so
oh,
good to have you here. I'm so glad you're a dropout,
me
a Sunday
too.
school and Bob Jones
I
dropout.
am so grateful to no thank you for having me and thank you for the work that you've done. Like your
Oh.
book has also been crucial in my journey too. And I know so many other people's with working through religious trauma and just, the work you do on social media and just even this podcast. 'Cause I don't know how we were talking about it for record. I don't know how you do a podcast amongst everything you do. But
Who
thank you.
knows? Yeah,
Yeah.
I might be sleeping right now as we're recording. I'm just kidding. No,
Yeah,
thank you. I appreciate it.
of
I'm glad we can be in
course.
this space
Me
together. It
too.
really means a lot.
Yeah, love it.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you again to Andrew Pledger for being here for 2 episodes. I just love Andrew. I know I said this on the podcast. Like, I became aware of him, I think, actually through Josh Harris's kind of Instagram live series. So that would have been, 3.5, 4 years ago. And I just remember him as this like incredibly passionate individual who was just so like ready, like, for lack of a better term, Christian term, like on fire. But he was like so ready to be connected to a community outside of high control religion. And he was so passionate to jump into what the ways were that he could provide support and hope and encouragement. And he has not stopped doing that since that point. And so it's just been so lovely to be a part of his life in the way that I can, across some different state lines, and to be able to see where he's come in the last few years is unbelievable. His story is one of so much inspiration and so much hope and so much resilience. And I'm really hopeful that people connect with it, connect with Andrew. He is such a lovely person to connect with. And yeah, make sure you follow him whenever he puts out a book. Fingers crossed it's soon. Go and buy it, all that stuff. But yeah, I really loved what he had to say at the end, just about being gentle with yourself and learning to love yourself and taking things slow and getting back into your body. I mean, if you listen to this podcast any length of time, you know that the other Andrew, my co-host Andrew, and I talk about, being in the body all of the time. And that's a message that I loved to quote unquote preach, because it's not dependent on another person doing it for you or another person having to be present or giving you permission. Your body gets to be your own authority. Your body gets to be your own guide, your own witness, and your own source of wisdom. And I don't know, I really love that. And I love that Andrew is hitting on that. One of my favorite kind of trauma quotes from one of the teachers that I've learned from, his name is Peter Levine. He says that the goal of healing trauma is to come back to your inherent sense of goodness. And I love that he uses the term come back, because it's a recognition that it's always been there, which is so different than what high control religion teaches, that we are evil or depraved or sinful or there's nothing good in us. And this is kind of like the giant, proverbial middle finger to religion of saying, like, there is inherent goodness within me. There always has been. And the reason I'm doing this work is to come back home to that inherent sense of goodness and to live from that space. And I was thinking of that quote as Andrew was talking about, like, if he could talk to the person who's been out of Bob Jones one day. That's the quote I was thinking of, at kind of summing up what he was saying, because it's one of the biggest gifts ever to live from that place of inherent goodness and letting that be the guiding light in your life as you continue to take steps forward. So My encouragement to you is to be curious about that sense of inherent goodness because you have it in yourself too, and to look for ways to live from that space. So I think that is it. That's another episode of Sunday School Dropouts. We will be back next week with another episode. But until then, all God's people said, Amen.